number 405 and number 406, if you prefer the hymn book, Have Faith in God and the Solid Rock. We're going to again sing the first and last stanza of both. Would you stand and sing with us as we begin to worship? Solid Rock, which is the next page over. Concerning the men's day next week, get your tickets early for the concert, the men's choir. So just get them early because they'll go fast. All right?
Well, as you're making your way back towards your seats, we will take your prayer concerns tonight. our study of the book of Genesis. We're in chapter 26 tonight. We're going to be looking at some interactions between Isaac and the Philistine king Abimelech. And so to sort of keep us in the timeline and we sort of know where we're at in what is going on, we need to understand that from what we read last week in chapter 25 with the selling of his birthright from Esau to Jacob, it has been 7 years. It's estimated by Bible scholars that this has been about 7 years time span between chapter 25 and 26. And so to give you sort of a reminder of how old our individuals are here, Isaac is about 98. Rebekah is somewhere around 77, and Jacob and Esau, the twins, are 38. And as of now, we don't see either one of them being married, so they're 38 years old and still living at home. And so that's sort of the layout of it. If you're looking for a historical date, this is about 1748 BC. So this is more than 1,700 years before Christ was born. And so we pick up in verses 1 through 6 in Genesis chapter 26. And we're looking at God's promise or promises to Isaac. So look with me in verses 1 through 6. It says, "Now there was a famine in the land besides the famine, or the previous famine in Abraham's time. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, in Gerar. The Lord appeared to Isaac and said, 'Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land where I tell you to live. Stay in this land for a while, and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands, and will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and will give them all these lands. And through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because Abraham obeyed me and did everything I required of him, keeping my commandments, my decrees, and my instructions.' So Isaac stayed in Gerar." So what we find at the very beginning of this part of the text and in chapter 26 here is that Isaac is dealing with a famine in the Negev, just like his father did a whole 100 years before him. So, this was this famine that Abraham experienced that they're talking about literally happened like 100 years before this famine that Isaac is experiencing. And it was so bad that in the Negev, which is really a lot of scrub brush, and there's really not a lot of very hospitable land down there. So again, I don't know why Isaac and Abraham loved it so much, but the famine made it to the point he couldn't live there. He couldn't stay there. And so he took his family and his herds and moved out. Now, God knew that Isaac may very well want to follow his father's example and head down to Egypt, but God told him under no uncertain terms, do not go to Egypt. Told him very explicitly, don't go to Egypt. That was not where he needed to go. And so instead of going down to Egypt, which, Egypt is a very fertile land, especially along the Nile. It would make sense for someone who has a lot of herds and a lot of different animals that would be a very tempting place to go. But instead, God tells him, eventually to go to Gerar. And so that's where Isaac went instead. And Gerar is right in the smack dab middle of Philistia, the Philistine kingdom. And so he went there and he lived under the rule of a king named Abimelech. Now, if you remember, when we were studying in the middle or the second section of Genesis, and we talked about Abraham going to Gerar, and he ends up living under a Philistine king. Do you remember the title he was called by? What was it? Abimelech, right? So how has this one king lived for 100 years? He hasn't. The key is that Abimelech is believed to have been a title, sort of like Pharaoh. Well, there weren't, or Caesar. They weren't. It wasn't the same person. It was a title that they claimed, and it's believed that there's another title that we'll see later in the story that was also a Philistine title that they used. So, that's one of the arguments that people will try to use to refute the validity of the Bible, saying, well, it can't be the same King Abimelech here and the same King Abimelech 100 years later, and it wasn't. It was a title. It was like Pharaoh or something like that for the Philistines. And so God told Isaac to stay in the land he told him to live in. So God's basically saying, live where I tell you to live, but don't go to Egypt. Go where I tell you to go. And he settles in Gerar. And God, in this conversation with Isaac, promises to bless Isaac. God promised to give Isaac and his descendants the land of Canaan and confirmed the oath that he had swore to Abraham. And God reiterated those promises that he had made to Abraham about numerous descendants, as the stars in the sky. And he once again promised that all nations on earth would be blessed through Abraham and Isaac's descendants. And for us, we realize that offspring that would bring about the change in the world and the blessing in the world that he's talking about here, we know that to be Jesus. We know that is the Messiah. Although Abraham and Isaac can't see that, 1,800 years later, they don't know that that's when it's going to happen or how it's going to happen. But we can see through the pages of Scripture that's what the reference is to. So this is where we see God sort of formally transferring the promise made to Abraham 125 years earlier for descendants, the land of Canaan, and the blessings on all of humanity. Is sort of God's formal transference from Abraham, who has died, to Isaac and his descendants. You remember we talked about a couple weeks ago that or last week I guess it was, that the birthright that Esau sold to Jacob, one of the benefits that came along with the birthright was a spiritual benefit that you would become basically the recipient of these blessings. You would be the one who would be in the line leading to the Messiah as we understand it. And so this is when that happens for him, and we see that goes on. And so God wanted Isaac to live in Gerar, and you see it here on the map. Hebron is right there. Actually, Jerusalem's right about there. But he had been down in the Negev, down in this region of Israel, and so he moves up. He may have even been living near Beersheba, but most likely it was in the Negev, and he moves to Gerar, and that's about 14 miles northwest of Beersheba and about 33 miles from Hebron. Now, in reference to modern-day current events, so to speak, Gaza is basically right in this region. That's the region of Gaza, and Gerar is about 10 miles, only 10 miles from the border of Gaza. Sort of south east of that border. And so the Gaza basically comes down and comes up, and it's just basically this rectangular state right there. And so if we go to verses 7 through 11, we see Isaac in Gerar and what happens there. It says, when the men of that place asked him about his wife, he said, "She is my sister." Because he was afraid to say, "She is my wife," he thought the men of this place might kill me on account of Rebekah, because she is beautiful. When Isaac had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked down from a window and saw Isaac caressing his wife Rebekah. So Abimelech summoned Isaac and said, "She is really your wife. Why did you say, 'She is my sister'?" Isaac answered him, "Because I thought I might lose my life on account of her." Then Abimelech said, "What is this you have done to us? One of the men might well have slept with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us." So Abimelech gave orders to all the people, "Anyone who harms this man or his wife shall surely be put to death." So while they're living in Gerar, Isaac used the same trick that his father had used a couple of times about 100 years earlier. And so he told people that Rebekah was his sister. Now, with Abraham and Sarah, that was a mostly truth. Still a lie, but it was mostly a truth because they were half brother and sister. And Abraham pointed out that she, later to Pharaoh or to Abimelech, that she was his sister. of the same father, but not of the same mother. And with Isaac, Isaac isn't even telling a whole truth. I mean, a half a truth. He's telling a whole lie. Because Rebekah is actually his first cousin one time removed. They shared the same, his grandfather was her great-grandfather. It was the same person, a man by the name of Terah, which was Abraham's father. But, we see it and we're like, okay, well, they not only are they, first cousins one time removed, but in addition to that, when they come into town, it's that whole issue of them 38-year-old twins that come with them. They have adult children. And so how it was able to, stay a secret for a little while, it says that after he'd been there a long time, Abimelech sees him. And so, in what we see, though, is that what ends up happening is, in Abraham's case, when he uses this whole "she's my sister" defense, both times God impressed upon Pharaoh and Abimelech in those cases that those kings should not touch Sarah. But in Isaac's case, he gets caught because he can't keep his hands off of his wife. Abimelech's looking out the window and he's like, "Whoa, wait a minute," and he realizes from the interaction between the two that they're not sister and brother. He realizes that they're married. And so in catching him, the story ends with Isaac being treated similar in some ways to Abraham when he's caught in the fact that it's his wife and not his sister. The ruler is outraged at the deception. People are warned against harming him. And in Isaac's case, he's not given any possessions by the ruler and asked to leave. That's what happened with Abraham in both cases. The ruler's like, "Here, take all of these servants and these flocks and leave." And that was how Abraham was treated. Isaac was not given anything. He was just basically given a tongue lashing, and that is all he got from Abimelech. But instead, what we see is that God is the one who takes care of increasing Isaac in a couple of ways. And so we see that that's what happens next. And so in verses 12 through 18, we see God blessing Isaac. And so look at verse 12. It says, "Isaac planted crops in that land, and the same year reaped 100-fold, because the Lord blessed him. The man became rich, and his wealth continued to grow until he became very wealthy. He had so many flocks and herds and servants that the Philistines envied him. So all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the time of his father Abraham, the Philistines stopped up, filling them with earth. Then Abimelech said to Isaac, 'Move away from us. You have become too powerful for us.' So Isaac moved away from there and encamped in the valley of Gerar, where he settled. Isaac reopened the wells that had been dug in the time of his father Abraham, which the Philistines had stopped up after Abraham died, and he gave them the same names his father had given them." So what was the reason that Isaac left Gerar in the first place? What did we read about at the very beginning of this chapter? Why did he leave the Negev? There was a what? A famine. And so we can assume that the famine is not solely in the area of the Negev. Typically famines are not regional in that small an area. Usually it's through a whole ecosystem, so to speak, that is affected by a lack of rain and dry, hot weather, things like that. And so we can assume that that Gerar was not immune from the famine, that the famine had to have reached that area to some degree. And although it may not have been as severe as it was in the Negev, we can rest assured that the famine had to have had some sort of impact there. And so what we can do is we can make the connection that God probably used some of the effects of the famine to help Isaac become wealthy. Because if God is blessing his crops and they're returning 100-fold return, then all of a sudden, this is making him stand out to the Philistines, especially if there's a famine in the land. So if you have the major supply in a time of high demand, you can write your own ticket. You can price it and make a lot of money. And that's what we should assume that Isaac did. And so we're told that he planted those crops, got 100-fold because the Lord blessed him. And then we read in verses 13 and 14 that he took what he had, basically what we see is that he took what he had received from Abraham, which would have been a substantial inheritance, and God added to it. So what he already had, God added to it, because remember, Abraham, due to his wealth amongst the Philistines and the people of Canaan, Abraham was viewed as royalty. That's how wealthy he was. They viewed him as a prince. And so to them, excuse me, to the Canaanites and to the Philistines, Abraham was a very, very wealthy person. And then when he dies, he passes it all along to Isaac, because Ishmael and the children of his concubines had been sent off. They all had left, and they had been given gifts, but Isaac was the one who received the bulk of the inheritance. And so, he took an already substantial wealth, and God increased it. And so we can understand that he had to have been a very, very wealthy man, because why else would a king tell a foreigner, and not even a foreign dictator or dignitary, a foreign man, why would he tell somebody like that, move away from us, you have become too powerful for us? That means that he had really increased the number of servants and maybe men who were trained with a sword and things like that. So Isaac is, he is just an unbelievably wealthy man because God has blessed him. And so as sort of a foreshadowing of events that is about to occur in the story, it's mentioned that the Philistines had filled in all of the wells after Abraham died that Abraham had his servants to dig when he was alive, in and around Gerar. And so, Daryl, can you go back to the map that showed us Gerar, and the one from a couple slides ago? Most likely what has happened from the story, from what we see, is that Isaac has been living in Gerar during this time of the famine. And so what he's doing is he is starting to slowly make his way back towards Beersheba. The place where where the city of Gerar, or the town of Gerar, was believed to have been, sets up on what is called a tell, T-E-L or T-E-L-L. But basically, it's a hill, and that's what it is. And between Gerar and Beersheba is the valley of Gerar, is what's believed to have been that. And so basically, the land is sloping. And so, for that 13 miles or so between Gerar and Beersheba, there is a lot of land. And so for Isaac, he's basically leaving Gerar, and he's going every little bit, as we'll see, in digging wells and things like that. But the wells that Abraham had dug between Beersheba and Gerar, mostly around Gerar, the Philistines went and filled in with dirt. Now that makes absolutely no sense to me. And I don't know why. There's no explanation as to why they would have done that we would probably know or realize. Because in their day, water, especially in that region of the world, water is more valuable than gold in a lot of ways. And so for the Philistines to go and fill in working wells that Abraham had dug, unless it was sort of a power play to say, this land is ours, it was Abraham's at one time and it was successful, but now it's ours. That's probably the only reason that they would have done that. So Isaac, on his march towards Beersheba, if you want to call it that, as he's doing that, he's beginning to reopen these wells that his father Abraham had dug, that the Philistines had filled back in with dirt. And it says that he gave them the same names. And, we might find it kind of odd that they were naming this well that name, and this well, that name, and different things like that. But we have to think about it from this perspective. It had to do with location and being able to communicate effectively on where people were going to be. for us, Misty and I, we have our farm where we do the skeet shoot and the farm day and things like that. We have our farm there, and then we keep cattle at my uncle's farm a couple miles down the road, and then we keep cattle at my dad's farm a couple miles down the road. But if I left my house, which is not on any of those three farms, and I told Misty that I was going to go work on the creek to make sure that the cows could get water, there's 7 creeks across those 3 farms. So if I just told Misty today that I was going to go work on the creek and maybe work on the fence at the creek, Misty would have no idea where I was going unless she asked me, well, at what farm or in what location, or she could call me on a cell phone. Well, guess what? Back then, they didn't have that luxury of calling and contacting people. So if they named the wells the same thing that Abraham had named them, it was a matter of identification for them. It was easy for them to know what region they were working in. And so Isaac would be able to keep track. You know, I mean, think about it. Again, this is a very wealthy man with lots of servants. And so he's got to keep track of where people are going and where different people are keeping herds at. And so for him, these points of reference that his dad had 100 years ago is easy for him to keep up with and for him to know what's going on. And so he names all of these wells that he's basically in Gerar and around Gerar, headed back towards Beersheba. He is naming all of these the same things that his dad had named them. And so in verses 19 through 22, we see about Isaac's wells. And we see the wells that he actually digs that are different. They're new wells. It says, beginning in verse 19, it says, Isaac's servants dug in the valley and discovered a well of fresh water there. But the herders of Gerar quarreled with those of Isaac and said, the water is ours. So he named the well Esek because they disputed with him. Then they dug another well, but they quarreled over that one also. So he named it Sitnah. He moved on from there and dug another well, and no one quarreled over it. So he named it Rehoboth, saying, now the Lord has given us room, and we will flourish in the land. So not only did Isaac have his servants opening up Abraham's wells, he's got servants. I mean, this guy, he's got a lot of servants, evidently. And so he's got servants opening Abraham's wells, but he also has them digging new wells as well. And so one newly dug well is disputed by the Philistine herders from Gerar. They come out, and so Isaac names it Esek, which means dispute or disputed. And when they run him off from that well that his servants have dug in the land of Gerar, he moves on and they dig another well. And the sheep herders or the herders, because there may have been goats, from Gerar come and make another problem for him, and they're really giving him opposition over it. So he calls it Sitnah, which means opposition. And so finally he moves far enough away from Gerar, and we don't know how far that is. We don't know if it was 2 miles. We don't know if it was 10 miles. We don't know how close he is to Beersheba or how far away he is from Gerar. But he finally digs another well, and nobody fights with him over this particular well. And so he calls it Rehoboth, which means room, that there is room for him to flourish. And so he is, he's probably ecstatic that this headache with the herders that are taking over his wells that he spent time and energy and money to open up, this finally pays off for him, and he's able to move out of the land and move to a place where God can bless him all the more, where God can flourish him as a descendant of Abraham. And so after this, we see that Isaac is slowly making his way from Gerar towards Beersheba. So look in verses 23 through 25, and we'll see what happens there. It says, from there he went to Beersheba. That night the Lord appeared to him and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you and will increase the number of your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham. Isaac built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord. There he pitched his tent, and his servants dug a well. And so it's kind of interesting. This last verse 25, sort of gives us this real idea of what's going on with Isaac, is that he's looking to settle down to some degree, and that's what he finds in Beersheba, is a place he can sort of kind of settle down, and that's saying a lot for nomads like they were. But from the valley of Gerar, it says that Isaac did what? He went where to Beersheba? He went up to Beersheba. Now, Beersheba, we saw from our map. Daryl, can I get you to go back to the map one last time for me? Daryl's probably up there saying, I ain't going back to the map. Looking at that, does that look like he's going up to Beersheba, looking at the map? No. Now, from our previous studies, you got to go way back in some of our previous studies before. When they went up, what does that mean if it wasn't a northerly direction? Do you remember? Elevation. They went up in elevation. And so Gerar and the valley of Gerar, where even though the city of Gerar would have been up on a hill, they were still down in the valley of Gerar. The difference in elevation was that where Gerar sits, they were at 372 feet above sea level. Beersheba sits at almost 900 feet above sea level. It's 853 feet. And so, there's almost a 500-foot elevation change between there. Even though Gerar sat down in a valley and Beersheba sat up, he went up. And, that's the thing that amazes me, is that they could tell the difference in a 500-foot elevation change over 13 miles. Because really, think about it. I've tried that at the farm before. I've stood on one hill with my iPhone attached to a satellite in space and looked at what the elevation is there, and then drove across the farm to another hill to see which one was higher in elevation, and could tell. And looking at it, you're like, yeah, that looks like it's a little higher, and it was. But for them, they were doing it from back in the day without GPS, without any of the things that we have. But they could tell that small a difference in that small a difference in elevation over that long a distance, which is pretty remarkable. Shows us how intuitive and how smart they really were. We look at them and we're like, oh, they were ancient peoples that didn't know a whole lot. They were a lot wiser than we realized and a lot smarter. So what we see is, Daryl, you can go back to the slide. When he gets to Beersheba, God appeared to Isaac just like God had appeared to Abraham years before. And so when he appears to Isaac, he makes some promises to him. Excuse me. He promised Isaac some of the same things that he had promised Abraham. He promised him his presence, he promised him his blessings, and he promised him descendants. And so this was, again, God promising Isaac multiple times the same things that he promised Abraham, just like he promised Abraham multiple times. And maybe the reason God has to make those promises and see them fulfilled for the people, but has to promise them a couple of times, is to keep them focused on what God has for them. That may have been the case. But after encountering God at Beersheba and God promising Isaac these things, Isaac built an altar. An altar was not something that they took as a small undertaking. This was, and not that it was some huge extravagant thing, but this meant that this place was important to them, because this was a place that they had encountered the living God. And that's why they built an altar. That's why Abraham built altars when he did, is because that was after his encounters with God. And so we see that with Isaac here. He builds this altar because this is a place that's going to be special to him, a place that's not only going to be special to him, but also to his descendants. And so he builds an altar, and he worshiped God there. And he settled in Beersheba, and he had another bit of foreshadowing and sort of a reach back to some of the issues he's already had. We're told that Isaac's servants have begun to dig a well. So let's look at verses 26 through 33 to wrap up the biblical text tonight, and look at Isaac and Abimelech's treaty. In verse 26 it says, "Meanwhile Abimelech had come to him from Gerar with Ahuzath, his personal advisor, and Pekol, the commander of his forces. Isaac asked them, 'Why have you come to me, since you were hostile to me and sent me away?' They answered, "We saw clearly that the Lord was with you, so we said, there ought to be a sworn agreement between us and you. Let us make a treaty with you that you will do us no harm, just as we did not harm you, but always treated you well and sent you away peacefully. And now you are blessed by the Lord." Isaac then made a feast for them, and they ate and drank. Early the next morning, the men swore an oath to each other. Then Isaac sent them on their way, and they went away peacefully. That day Isaac's servants came and told him about the well they had dug. They said, "We found water." He called it Sheba, and to this day the name of the town has been Beersheba. So while Isaac is settling down in Beersheba, in that area, and really, he's pitched his tent, so he's going to stay there a while. He's digging a well. He's set up the family worship center with the altar, and so he is there. All of a sudden, Abimelech, his advisor Ahuzath, and his army commander Pekol all visited him. Now, don't think that your pastor is smart enough to know how to pronounce those names, because I'm not. There is a very good resource that I've told you about before, Blue Letter Bible. This is for our Sunday school teachers. If you want to know how to pronounce a word, look it up on Blue Letter Bible, like Red Letter Bible, blueletterbible.com. Find your Bible verse that you're looking at, and there's a place on the left-hand side beside the Bible verse that says Tools. If you click on that, you'll see a speaker icon beside the words that you're trying to pronounce, and they'll tell you how to do it, and or they'll pronounce it for you. And so it gives you a real understanding of the difference. Now, you have to understand, like, this one word, I'm trying to think one that I talked about earlier. It looks like Rehoboth, as we would say it, Rehoboth. It actually is Rehoboth, like a V, because when you see a B in the English in the Old Testament, chances are it's probably actually a V because of the way Hebrew's written. But that website will give you a great resource on how to pronounce the names and the words in the Old Testament. It makes me look smarter than I actually am. So you can do the same thing with your Sunday school class, if that's the case. And so these three show up. One is the king Abimelech, one is his advisor, and one is the commander of the army. And so those three show up to make a treaty with Isaac. And so they come, and it's kind of interesting. Isaac's like, "What are y'all doing here?" That's the southern slang translation of what he says. He's like, "What are y'all doing here?" And y'all kicked me out of town, and now you're coming to talk to me. And Isaac's very wise in asking that, not to just sort of go into it blindly. But they come in, and it's kind of interesting when you read that. I love the way it reads, because they're like, they said, "We saw clearly that the Lord was with you," playing on his religious beliefs. And he says, it says, "So we said," so the three of them are talking about, "we said, there ought to be a sworn agreement between us." No, you didn't want to come make an agreement with Isaac because you saw that the Lord was with him. You didn't want him to come and take over Gerar and kill you all. That's really what it was. They were protecting, they were covering themselves, if you want to look at it from that direction. They were trying to be very careful about the way things happen, because probably what happened is, although we're not told this in Scripture, chances are after Isaac left and they had told him, "You've got to leave," they were probably talking, the army commander, the king, and his advisor, top advisor. They're probably talking, they're like, "Do you think Isaac's going to come back? Do you think we made him mad in the way that we sent him out? We probably need to do a peace treaty with him." And so they're brainstorming what they're going to do. And so you can imagine on that 13-mile ride from Gerar to Beersheba, they're trying to get their story straight. Yeah, we need to tell him that the Lord was blessing you, and we need to make a treaty with you. That's a bunch of hooey. They were afraid that Isaac could really wipe out Gerar and take over. And so that's really what they were worried about. And so their request was, or their request for a treaty was, that neither side would harm the other. And, I don't think Isaac was really concerned about them harming him, even though they had a legit army. they're really concerned that Isaac's going to come because he's grown so wealthy and has so many servants and things like that. And this really shows us just how much God had blessed Isaac if the Philistines were worried that he was going to attack them or retaliate against them. And so, as in Abraham's day, when we read back in Genesis 21, Isaac is the one who has to foot the bill because they want to come and make a peace treaty with him. So what does Isaac do? He throws a feast. He picks up the tab on dinner, so to speak, and they celebrate this agreement. The next day, they swear an oath to each other, and Isaac let them leave peacefully. I think that's kind of telling that Isaac didn't have to, but he did. He let them leave peacefully. And so if we were, sometimes we think about these stories again and we're thinking about how would it look if we were watching a movie or a TV show. I think that what it would look like is that these three guys from Gerar are leaving with their entourage of soldiers and, all this sort of stuff. And they're leaving, heading back towards Gerar, and in comes Isaac's servants riding on camels or walking in. And so they're sort of passing, they're leaving to go back to Gerar, and Isaac's servants are coming in. And what we find is that when they get back, they tell him, say, guess what? We struck water. Which again is worth more than gold to them in that region of the world. And so he named the well Sheba, because Sheba means oath. And so because they had just made this oath, he's like, you know what, I'm going to name this one as a reminder of this oath. And he named the place Beersheba, which means well of the oath. And this well is still here today. So Daryl, I'm going to walk you through these three pictures. So, he come from Gerar and come through the valley, and he settles in Beersheba, and that's where his guys are digging this well. And so just so I wanted to make sure you saw where Jerusalem and Hebron were in regards to all of this and the Dead Sea. And so in Beersheba, he digs this well, and that's what he names it, is, Beersheba. So go to the next one, Daryl. And so this is the city of Beersheba. If you zoomed in, that red dot is where the well is, and that is the river that goes through the southern portion of Beersheba. And Daryl, if you would go to that next picture. That right there is the well that you read about in this text. That is, they call it Abraham's well, which is ironic because Abraham didn't dig it. Isaac's servants did. But they relate it to Abraham and his descendants because of Isaac. But that is the well in Beersheba. The river is like right here, not very far. I think the river was, it was like 500 feet from that well. This right here is like a museum type thing that you can go through. But if you're ever in Israel and you're in the southern portion near Beersheba, Shiva as it's pronounced, but if you're in Beersheba, you can actually go and visit that well and see the well that we read about in tonight's text. And so it's kind of cool that that's off of Google Maps, and I just zoomed all the way in, and so you can find things like that. But it's pretty interesting. So I'm going to wrap us up tonight with looking at the lessons that we learned from Isaac and Rebekah. And what we see here is easy for us to pick out, is that God keeps his promises. And we see that through this whole text, because the promises that God made to Abraham back in chapters 15 and 18 and chapter 22, they were promises for descendants, that he would occupy the land of Canaan, or that his family would occupy the land of Canaan, and blessings that his family would bless the entire world, that the entire world would be blessed through a descendant that came from Abraham. And so we see these promises starting to occur in Abraham's life during his time, but they really start to come true in Isaac's time, especially in chapters 25 and 26, because we see more descendants coming on, because we'll see these promises become more and more complete as we go through the last section of Genesis, when we get to the life and times of Joseph. And so we'll see that, and even as you work through into the book of Exodus, you see the promises becoming even more with the Exodus and the Israelites coming into the promised land and taking over the promised land. Now, God promised Isaac the same thing in verses 2 through 5 of tonight's text that he had previously promised it to Abraham. And one aspect of the promise had already been accomplished back in chapter 25, in that now he had descendants. And not only descendants, but the beginning of two nations, the Israelites and the Edomites. And so out of Abraham, he's the father of many nations. Well, he was the father of the Ishmaelites, who would eventually take Joseph into Egypt. He was the father of the Israelites. He was the father of the Edomites. And so we see this promise coming to fruition in chapter 25. And God promised to bless and prosper Isaac, and we see that coming about in verses 12 through 14 tonight, that God is helping him to have 100-fold crop from the year before. You know what? If I could get 100-fold bales of hay out of my hay field compared to the year before, I would take it in a heartbeat. And, we think about it. That is a real blessing for an agricultural society. And so not only that, God so greatly fulfilled the promise that he was going to bless Isaac, that the Philistines envied him. That's what the scripture said. They envied him and threatened. They were threatened by Isaac's his prosperity. And it's kind of interesting that these pagans attributed Isaac's success and his blessings to the living God of Israel. And so it's amazing that they saw where those blessings were coming from. And so really what we have to take to heart is that what God promises, he's going to bring about in our life. When we read in Scripture and we see promises that can be attributed to us as followers of Christ, we have to know that God is going to fulfill those promises because he keeps his promises. Now, does that mean that every blessing and every promise in the Bible is applicable to the believer or the follower of Christ? Not necessarily. There are Old Testament blessings and promises that were attributed to Isaac and Abraham and their family and the Jews, and they were specific for them and not necessarily for the Christian. Does God promise to make us prosperous like he did Isaac? We don't see that in the Scriptures. Does God promise to give us 35,000 square miles of land in the Middle East like he did Isaac and Abraham? We don't see that. But does he promise us, like he did Isaac, that he will be with you and bless you? Yes, we see that in Scripture, and we know that's a promise that he makes to us. Does he promise to forgive us of our sins if we repent and ask for his forgiveness? Yes, we see that in multiple places in the Gospels. Not only that, does he promise us salvation and eternal life if we believe in Jesus Christ? Yes, and that's a promise that we can cling to. And does he promise us a place in heaven when this life is over if we're a follower of Christ? Yes, he does. And so we can trust those. I guess the last one I would say is, does he promise us his strength, not our strength, but his strength for the things that we face in life? Yes, he does. And does he promise Jesus is coming back for us either at the rapture or our death? Yes, he does. And we can cling to those promises. And so many of those promises that we are given in the Scriptures, we've already seen fulfilled in our lives. And if they haven't already been fulfilled in our lives, we can trust that the others will be fulfilled as well, because God keeps his promises. And so that is the end of our study of chapter 26. Are there any questions before we wrap up tonight? Well, if there's not any, then just a reminder, Wednesday night we'll be in here at 7 o'clock, meal at 6 o'clock. The Bible study on Philippians will be wrapping up on Wednesday night, so I hope that you'll be here at 7 o'clock for that. Saturday, weather permitting, we'll have the skeet shoot. It's not looking really good because of the rain. But we'll make a decision by Thursday so we can get the word out on the phone tree if we can have it or not. Sunday is Baptist Men's Day, breakfast at 8 o'clock in the Family Life Center. So I want to encourage our men to be here for that. Choir practice at 9:15 for the men that are singing in the choir. And then we'll finish out our series on Who Do You Say Jesus Is? With a look at the answer of the Messiah. And so that is the direction that we're headed in the next week. So I'm going to ask Keith if he would close us out with a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed.